the Europeans are treating AI in the same way as you treat everyday products or toys, because toys in Europe, they need the certificate Europa mark as well. AI also requires a certificate Europa mark if it's a high-risk system. Does a sandbox help? It may or may not work in other countries because those other countries may not even have a regulator. Is there a regulator that's actually there, police watching the sandbox? Do we need one? European, once again, setting the gold standard for regulation. Their concept of AI is you've got an AI system that takes inputs and infers. Hong Kong doesn't have a specific piece of law on artificial intelligence. Each regulator coming up with their own guidelines or circulars. If you argue that your AI system is not Gen AI, then the circular doesn't apply.
How can the regulators make sure that we still reap the best benefits of Gen AI but not over-regulate?
They're in a difficult position where they obviously want to protect the financial system. They also want to protect consumers. The best way forward is trying to see what are the common issues and create a basic set of protections which are universally adopted.
Welcome to the Pulse Check podcast. Thank you for coming over, Errol Bong, representing the regulatory environment world in the very hot topic of data and AI. So maybe before we go into details, of course, as you know, I start with an icebreaker and then want to get to know you a bit better before we go into the topic. So starting with yourself, what makes you you?
Yeah, that's a great question. What makes me someone that can speak about artificial intelligence? I'm a lawyer by trade, qualified to practice law in Hong Kong, Australia, New York, Washington, and England. And I've been working for the top-tier investment banks, top-tier financial institutions, and more recently helping out crypto clients, digital asset clients, and technology clients as well. And you're absolutely right that the hot topic at the moment is artificial intelligence. It's the latest disruptive technology. It's seen as something impacting everyone's life. It's drawing a lot more attention than other new technologies that we're seeing at the moment, such as full self-driving. So definitely we're getting a lot of questions and comments being asked. Sometimes you think of lawyers as just people sitting in the courthouse, but I'm both a legal professional as well as working in compliance as well. So, and I think nowadays legal and compliance are working more hand in hand. The lawyers advise on the law, but the compliance guys make sure that an organization complies with the law. And I've done both. So, what I'm hoping to do is help not only talk about what are the artificial intelligence regulations, but what are the kind of practical steps that organizations can take to make sure they comply. And, we're looking and talking not just in terms of the people developing AI, but also the financial institutions that are adopting AI. And I think that's the next step. Everyone's been thinking about AI as a free public service, but more and more we are seeing AI systems more like a product designed to, as most all products are, designed to generate revenue, designed to be sold to customers. And one of the key customers for AI will, of course, be financial institutions, particularly in Hong Kong, where that's a major business sector.
Delving also a bit more out of you as a person. I mean, as you are, of course, lawyer and in legal and compliance, why also AI? Did you have any affinity to technology or engineering?
Yeah, that's a great question. So right now I'm helping some financial institutions with their AI adoption programs. Helping them work out, okay, what do we need to do first before we start adopting and using AI? They themselves, particularly international organizations, are asking, look, I might be headquartered in Europe, but I have a Hong Kong branch, a Singapore branch, an Australian branch, and maybe an offshoring center in India. I want to adopt this AI solution that my headquarters in Europe is adopting, but implement it throughout all my branches, because that's the only way I'm going to generate efficiency and generate a good return for my investment in an AI solution. So they want to make sure that before they go ahead and roll out an AI solution in all jurisdictions, they're not going to have the regulator knocking on the door saying, what have you done? Have you done any due diligence? Do you know what the local requirements are? They are kind of very conscious of making sure that they generate their efficiencies or the returns they're getting from AI, but also minimizing their risk. And I think that's where we're seeing the market maturing. When AI first came out in 2022, 2023, it was seen as the next kind of big disruptive technology, which was fantastic, and it's still fantastic still. But there was a lot of the wow factor, ranging from Skynet-style Terminators, taking over humanity, all through to people paranoid about losing their jobs. But now we're seeing it more kind of commoditized, becoming more of a product or service. And just like any service, financial institutions and other institutions are saying, okay, should I treat this like a service that, like an outsourcing service, where it's filling some functions that I would have needed to do internally, hire a lot of people, and of course create all the kind of inefficiencies with a purely human run process. Can I create some efficiencies while adopting AI? But how do I keep the humans in the loop, and where do I need to keep the humans in the loop? So we're really seeing kind of a more turn in the market towards a more mature kind of product, a more mature kind of service. And that's exactly how financial institutions and other key clients for AI products are now viewing AI.
So it was more that the market really asked for it, and that's where you started to also, of course, specialize yourself into the topic a bit. So going now into the questions, and maybe also for the audience, of course, everyone talks about AI, and you mentioned 2022. Of course, AI is already part of capabilities in banks since decades when it comes to classical AI, when it comes more to the prescriptive AI models where it's very clear, okay, I do a Black-Scholes financial market analysis, and I leverage, of course, a lot of data to make the right estimations. But we talk here about generative AI, which is in that sense non-deterministic, and of course you're the lawyer here in terms of how relevant this is, that of course the result you get is not black and white, is not 1 and 0, and that when it comes to banking in a highly regulated environment, if suddenly you get input from Gen AI, one of these large language models that may not be correct in respective use case, that could be knock down the impact, also hitting, of course, end customers of banks that may lose money. And in, again, highly regulated environments, this is, of course, something that the regulators are very much interested in. You do still the right thing as a regulated institution. There are different approaches that the different regulators are taking in US, Europe, and Asia. And my first question would go to you as an expert on the European EU AI Act that was launched, and how this, we can maybe quickly summarize some of the key elements, and also how this compares to what, for example, Hong Kong is doing and adopting, and also maybe Southeast Asia, Singapore, and other financial markets. So what do you see from a pure regulatory AI?
Yeah, you've hit the nail on the head that financial institutions and other organizations may have been using older versions of pre-Gen AI tools, whether it's robo-advisors or chatbots or what have you. But and you're right that the focus at the moment is on Gen AI. Interestingly, and you raised a very good point about the European Union AI Act. And the interesting thing about the Europeans is that they're once again setting the gold standard for regulation. That they set the gold standard when it came to privacy with their GDPR, and they're setting the gold standard again with the AI Act. And the interesting thing about the AI Act is it doesn't focus purely on Gen AI. In fact, their concept of AI is, I think, very clever, and it follows what the OECD is doing in terms of how the OECD treats AI, because they're not solely focusing on Gen AI and not building a definition of AI based on just Gen AI, which means that if AI adopts it again in the future, that's okay. The AI Act will still apply. Their concept of AI is you've got an AI system that takes inputs and infers, and that's a key idea in the AI Act in Europe, is inference. The AI system infers and produces an outcome, whether it's a forecast, a prediction, a decision, based on such inference. And the basic concept of the European definition of AI is, look, it's a system where we're not following, which is generating its own rules based on the input data. It's not rules set by some human programmer, which is your chatbot or your robo-advisor, but a new set of rules that's being created by the AI system itself based on its input data. And that kind of concept of AI is what the Europeans would hope to be a future-proofed concept of AI that will stand the test of time. And as we move on from Gen AI, the AI Act in Europe will still continue to apply to AI in its future forms. So that's the very interesting thing, first of all. Contrast that with, and you brought up Hong Kong, and I'll get into Hong Kong in a little bit more detail, but Hong Kong does not, like a lot of other jurisdictions in APAC, like a lot of other countries in APAC, doesn't have a specific piece of law on artificial intelligence. So what we're seeing in, for example, in Hong Kong is each regulator coming up with their own guidelines or circulars on artificial intelligence. So if we look at the securities regulator in Hong Kong, the Hong Kong Securities and Futures Commission, which is responsible for regulating brokers, asset managers, those kind of financial institutions, their focus is on Gen AI. So they've come up with a Gen AI circular, which is, and if you argue that your AI system is not Gen AI, then the circular doesn't apply. And indeed, when one of the review projects that I've done for a financial institution, the conclusion was actually the Hong Kong securities regulators in Gen AI circular didn't apply to this particular vendor and its system because it wasn't Gen AI. But going back to Europe, like I said, it's setting the gold standard, and given the size of the European market, it may be it's similar to what happened with privacy. A lot of organizations, both providers of AI systems as well as the users or the clients of the AI system, may end up saying, look, it's too hard to comply with Hong Kong requirements in some cases, or Singapore requirements in other cases. We're just going to say, hey, look, if we're a European organization, we want to make sure that the AI system complies with European standards across all the countries where we're deploying it, and see, where are the gaps. So it's more of a gap analysis in terms of, okay, what's the differences between Europe and say Hong Kong, and is there a gap that needs to be filled here, as opposed to let's try and fit and comply with each country's requirements. That may very well be the outcome of the Europeans moving first and the Europeans coming up with a gold standard for AI regulation.
I mean, you call it now the gold standard all the time. There's also, of course, constant jokes on European Union overregulates.
Yes.
For example, the plastic bottle where the top is attached and people are getting annoyed on what is actually the benefit of this regulation. And me, as a Swiss coming from Switzerland, which is not part of the European Union, by the way, even more so making jokes and funs on it. I mean, there's a risk that you overregulate, which then also leads to less innovation and less actual benefit for the end client. I mean, what the regulators still want is that it's, of course, to protect the financial services clients, banking customers, for example, but also, of course, still driving towards innovation. For example, with virtual banking in Hong Kong, open banking, and so on. So it's not to just only overregulate. And now, what I fear is if it's over regulations and the banks say, okay, then I can't do anything. Customers, they use Gen AI, of course, right? I myself personally test it out all the time on asking Grok or ChatGPT on out of the Magnificent Seven, which stock would you recommend to buy right now based on risk aspects, but also price-earning ratio and so on, of where Google is just under 20 versus Microsoft being at the 35 and so on right now. So clients will start to use it, and if the banks are not really offering their services also, and of course also taking some of the good capabilities on board, then there might be a disadvantage and you cannot even serve the customer as you should, while of course you need to protect him. So, sorry, long-winded topic, but how can the regulators make sure that we still reap the best benefits of Gen AI, but not over-regulate, while of course still making sure the end clients are protected? Do you have a bit of a view on that?
Yeah, that's a very good question. And I think, the regulators in APAC in particular are in a interesting position where, the first question is, okay, I don't have any legislation that's specific to artificial intelligence. So I can only regulate people within my jurisdiction, my territory. So, going back to Hong Kong, like I said, it's a complex situation because we've got the Hong Kong Monetary Authority, which regulates banks. We've got the Hong Kong Securities and Futures Commission, which regulates, your asset managers, your securities brokers, people like financial institutions such as those, and they can rely on their general powers to issue requirements on their on the people to whom they give licenses to, but other than that, they don't have any wider powers. So and that kind of and they'll also need to be careful that they don't exceed what they're supposed to do. So people would say, look, HKMA, you're there to make sure that the banks don't go bust and customers are protected and so on. But you're not necessarily the AI police. That's not your key job. Same thing with the SFC. So they're in a difficult position where they obviously want to protect the financial system. They also want to protect consumers. They also want to make sure that banks and other financial institutions, when they adopt AI, don't suffer any significant risk in doing so. Contrast that with Europe, where they have all the powers and they've got a European regulator, but they also have in each member state a regulator as well. So going back to your original question, how do we? What's the best way forward? And I think the best way forward, in my opinion, is trying to see what are the common issues that all consumers are going to be interested in, regardless of which country they're from, and seeing how we can create a basic set of protections which are universally adopted. And we do, in certain circumstances, have regulators that speak to each other on an international basis. They've got the Bank of International Settlements as a kind of broader platform. You have certain forums where regulators, particularly banking regulators, particularly securities regulators, can sit down and compare notes. But and it will be good at these kind of in these kind of forums for these regulators to come up with at least some basic set of common issues which all regulators and all consumers and all institutions are going to be interested in addressing, so that, and this will help the vendors and developers of AI systems understand where they sit as well, because they, I think, like I said, the market is heading to a more mature area where you've got a lot of it's not just ChatGPT or Google or Microsoft anymore, but you've got so many vendors and solutions providers, all with an AI solution embedded. I mean, dare I say, if you go to a concert, you'll probably find someone there that's working in AI. Definitely a Coldplay concert, you'll find someone, maybe even a CEO. But
exactly.
It's becoming a more common issue. And I think if we have a more set of common standards, that would be very helpful for everyone. Common ideas like, hey, if your personal data is being used to train an AI system, have you given your consent to it? Do you even know about it? So, number one, consent. Number two, transparency. Do you even know that your personal data is maybe used to train an AI system? The third kind of major principle is ensuring that there's fairness and no discrimination. So we don't want your sets of beliefs or even your nationality as a non-local person. We wouldn't want you to be in a more difficult or disadvantageous position compared to others based on an AI's decision. So I think there's just as we're talking now, there's three common sets of criteria or issues that all regulators are interested in, all users of AI are interested in, and all consumers are also interested in as well.
One example we can also take here is GDPR, and you're the lawyer and can give then also the legal formulation in detail. But the fact that, of course, you need to give consent on your data, that it's being stored and what data is being stored. And in Europe, if you are an institution, is GDPR has to be GDPR compliant. Of course, you have the pop-ups you see where you have to click on accept that, hey, it's okay that you track my whatever personal data for marketing purposes, for example. It was to an extent that everyone is now just annoyed and clicking it away and still not actually really realizing what he's sharing his data for. And so there's a bit of the good and bad in terms of course, it should be transparent on what your data is being used for, to also, of course, not having to click through too many pop-ups whenever you click now, where Gen AI large language models are being used to calculate something in the background. In that regard, I think it's probably also a bit how do we find out over time what is best for the end client? What I would see would be a good model is to also have a sandbox type of environment, which is being used in the context of open banking, maybe also in terms of AI, that helps to play around in a bit of a protected environment. Do you see this as becoming a trend or an approach?
Yeah, well, look, I think because, say for Europe, which has a clear requirement for registration of AI, in a lot of other countries, it's not a requirement necessarily. So the need for a sandbox may not be as apparent in other countries where the need to register your AI system is not a requirement. Having said that, AI vendors can still maybe sit head and shoulders above their competitors by saying, hey, look, we know that you, a financial institution in Hong Kong, have to jump through the following due diligence hoops before you perhaps adopt the AI system. we can help you with that. I mean, we've already done, for example, a privacy impact assessment. Here it is. Our competitors haven't even thought about that. They haven't thought about making their AI system more user-friendly for their customer, but we have, and we've done all that. And it's sometimes knowing what your customers need, and I think that this is not just an issue for AI, but for all products, knowing what your customers need and satisfying that need can sometimes give you a competitive advantage. Going back to your point about a sandbox, the beauty of the European system is, if you're categorized as a high risk AI system, you need to be registered, and you actually need to get a CE mark, a Certificate Europa mark. So interestingly, the Europeans are treating AI in the same way as you'd treat everyday products or toys, because toys in Europe, they need the Certificate Europa mark as well. AI also requires a Certificate Europa mark if it's a high risk system. The AI provider has to get that registration, or depend.
So every AI software company needs to have the mark as well. So not only, let's say it's a B2B company, so the software company providing a solution that a bank is using needs the mark, and then the bank that is using it probably also needs the mark because it's applying it.
Well, again, the Europeans are, how shall I say, they're being very European in their approach. So they said, look, we're going to categorize you. You being a Swiss national, you've probably seen this before. But the Europeans are categorizing the people in the AI supply chain. They're saying, okay, you've got a provider, the person that develops the AI system. You've got a importer, because if that system is developed outside Europe, you've got someone that maybe bringing it to the market and maybe localizing it, making sure that it can handle local language, French or what have you. And they might treat the importer in the same way as they treat the provider if the importer is making modifications to the AI system, or saying it's theirs, putting their own trademark on top of the AI system, and claiming they're very much part of that. You've got as I said, the distributor, and or what you and I would call the customer, or the deployer, the person that's actually deploying the AI system. So it might be a bank, it might be some other financial institution. That's the deployer. The obligation to get the CE mark is applicable if it's categorized as high risk. Again, the Europeans love categorizing things. They'll say either unacceptable risk, an unacceptable risk system is banned in Europe. You've got a high risk system. Okay, you need to get it registered. You've got and then you've got lower levels as well. You might have a minimal risk, like nothing required. And you might have something in the middle which requires transparency. In other words, you need to tell the consumer, the end retail person, hey, you're using an AI system, but it might be seen as a minimal risk or low level risk, and therefore only transparency requirements apply. But yes, the Europeans will categorize everything. They'll categorize the people in the supply chain. They'll categorize the AI system. So going back to your original question, which is, does a sandbox help? It definitely helps to the extent that you're dealing in a environment where you need to get things registered. Definitely, perhaps in Europe, in certain European countries, it might help with themselves being seen as a development hub for AI. It may or may not work in other countries because those other countries may not even have a regulator. So you'd say, who's even setting up the sandbox and who's kind of policing the sandbox? Is there a regulator that's actually there, police watching the sandbox? Because if there isn't, then do we need one? It's like I said, the Europeans are very interesting because once you've got that CE mark and you can say, well, I've got that CE mark now. Yes, the Europeans treat my AI system as high risk, but by getting the CE mark, I've discharged a number of hurdles. I've got a whole bunch of risk mitigation steps. Here they are, and again, giving that to your customer, whether it's bank or financial institution, and saying, okay, I'm compliant with all these requirements, you know there's a human in the loop, there's other risk mitigation steps that I've got in place that can help the bank or financial institution in their due diligence process. I'm not saying due diligence is a tick the box process, but it certainly helps say, yeah, okay, done.
It's very interesting, especially these categories you mentioned before, because in reality, right now, there's not that many actual companies building the models, the large language models. Of course, you have OpenAI as their tool, ChatGPT, that was the first really making it as really with this global presence, even though, of course, there were others working on this as well. Then you have, of course, Meta AI, you have Google Gemini, and, of course, DeepSeek here in China. 6, 7 maybe globally well-known large language model providers. And actually, it's not ChatGPT, that's actually only the tool, but it's really the OpenAI, the language models with different releases, of course, that in the end are leveraging the data. And this importer you mentioned before is quite interesting, yes, because, of course, if you send data now of your customer, you have in Switzerland to maybe then a server in the US where the model is being run and trained on. Of course, there's a lot of complexity, especially when it comes to maybe a private banking context where, of course, client-sensitive data is really such an important topic. Right? I do know, of course, now every government is considering even building their own large language models, including Switzerland. There is ETH and EPFL, the two technical universities. I studied at ETH, that's why I know it, where they built a Swiss model, which actually will be then fully open source, that will be trained or is being trained on 1,000+ different languages, making sure it's not only English and the common, mostly used languages. So I have a sense that every government is looking into, hey, we need to have one in China, one in Taiwan, and so on, that is really also trained in our country, and we can have a bit more control on it. Really a lot of complexity when it comes to, okay, this is the model, this is actually the tool, and then this is the provider of using the solution with different models and the different tools, which makes it even more complex to regulate. So there's a whole supply chain, and this in the context of, for example, Apple producing an iPhone where there's also a very long supply chain, and at the very end you had maybe one component of the Apple phone where not all the regulations were fulfilled. One provider didn't have all the employment laws in place and so on. In AI, this could then be similar, that you use the large language model just for one aspect in your tool you were not even aware of, that was not actually following all the regulations.
Yeah, and you know that comes from the fact that, again, the Europeans love setting this, being the first one out of the starting block, because they basically said, look, if your AI system is using the data of personal data of European persons, then European regulation is going to touch you. And if you're making your AI system available to Europeans, European regulation is going to touch you. So it's extraterritorial in effect. That's a fancy legal word for saying, even if you're sitting outside Europe, if your AI system is being used by Europeans or using personal data of Europeans to train your AI model, you're subject to European regulation. And the Europeans have used, and before the UK left Europe, the UK regulators also used, at that point in time, the common EU legislation against foreign corporations. So the best example is Facebook. Back in the day, where there was that big scandal of the Russian election interference in UK elections, and Facebook was being seen as facilitating that, they used the GDPR to issue penalties against Facebook, even though, of course, Facebook and the other players were sitting outside the European Union, and they were based in of course, the US. So it'll be interesting to see the Europeans try and run the same or have new cases where this time, instead of using the GDPR, they're using the European Union Artificial Intelligence Act. But yes, it's like GDPR, the European Artificial Intelligence Act is extraterritorial. It's also got the big fines, which is what got GDPR to the attention of a lot of boards of directors of many international companies when it first was launched. And there's the same big penalties because the penalties are based on global turnover. So it should have corporations and their board of directors thinking about, okay, am I in scope of Europe or not? So it's Europe, like I said, is should be something, and the European laws should be something in the minds of the AI vendor. And definitely, it's something that they should talk to a professional about and say, look, we're a startup. We're using data. Do we need to, as you quite rightly say, be careful of where that data is coming from?
So it brings me also to the final question, and you touched, of course, on it in terms of AI providers. As we are also a platform provider with Synpulse 8, where we have Pulse 8 as our platform, our product, where of course we use AI to engineer and develop the platform. Our engineers, they're all using Cursor AI and other AI capabilities with various large language models. We test, of course, all of them, but also provide then a platform to our clients that they can use, where they, of course, can decide themselves. Do they use which large language model they use, also based on, of course, where they operate in and what their preference is. So if I develop such a solution due to the EU standard that you believe will become a bit the gold standard for all other jurisdictions as well, so maybe even HKMA then or regulators in Asia will also start to adopt. So for me, building that solution, I should really go through the different requirements that I now need to fulfill. And is it easy and readily available online through EU Act to even study it? And
the good thing about the European Union's Artificial Intelligence Act is it's actually a regulation, just like GDPR. So both GDPR and the AI Act are both regulations, which means that unlike this for non-Europeans, here's a quick summary of how Europe works. But in Europe, they have either laws in the form of a directive or a regulation. If it's a directive, then it needs to be transposed by each European Union member state into their national law. And of course, each member state will kind of write it down slightly differently and put different emphasis. And so when it comes to directives, there's more wiggle room for each different EU member state to do their own, dare I say, slightly different thing, which makes it, as you say, a little bit trickier. It's like, gosh, okay, in France they've written it this way, but in Germany they've written it that way. They're kind of saying this broadly the same thing, but the nuance is very different. Whereas with a regulation, it's going to apply across all member states. It doesn't need to be transposed into national law, and therefore it makes it much clearer. So to answer your question, hey, is it easy to follow? It is easier than a directive where with a directive you're going to have to look at the local laws of each European Union member state to make sure you properly comply. It's got that kind of benefit to it. And I think when I say gold standard, I mean gold standard in terms of consumer rights, because not necessarily gold standard for AI providers. It could be a gold standard headache, but it's definitely gold standard in terms of protecting consumer rights. Because like the GDPR, you remember in GDPR, consumers can come up and, for example, correct the personal data, which is particularly important for things like credit agencies. You've got a bad credit score, you think this is wrong, this is bad based on the wrong data. And you have a right as a European to go and say to either a European-based data processor or a foreign data processor correct it. So you're right. A lot of people are getting numb and clicking things, but when it comes back to bite the consumer, they can then go and have a right to correct it. So that's what I mean by gold standard. Funny enough, the AI Act doesn't give as much rights to the individual as the GDPR. And indeed, when you're and this goes back to your earlier question about, is it easy to decipher the European requirements and the European regulations? Yes, for the reasons I gave before, but also no, because AI is regulated both by the AI Act plus the GDPR. The GDPR because of personal data and because of the rights of the individual. So in the same way that right now, or even before AI was launched, Europeans could come and correct their personal data to a data processor, they can come up to a large language model provider and say, hey, correct it, correct the data here. So you have as an AI system developer, you have two pieces of legislation to look at. So yes, it's helpful because it's a regulation, not a directive, but you have two pieces of legislation that is relevant to you.
I think I look forward into a future where my vision would be that, of course, I as consumer, I'm always on top of the data that is being captured about me, especially in financial services. You mentioned the credit score, that I would have on a blockchain my know your customer KYC data, my credit score, where of course all the financial institutions, they screen me, they look at me, assess me, analyze me, and then give me the result, and it's in my blockchain, but I can always validate it and also maybe challenge it. As I said before, with GDPR, I could call up and say, hey, this is wrong, there's something needs to be looked at here, or you have to delete my data, I don't want to work with you anymore. Right? So for example, I go to a new bank and say, hey, I want to now bank with you, here are my data, use it, right? And then I don't want to work with you anymore, give me back my data. So it would be more with the consumer rather than with different institutions, credit institutions that don't even know what data they have from me. And when it comes to now AI, it would be very interesting for me to say, hey, actually I want to now have a view on, again, Magnificent Seven, where should I invest in, maybe also with my preferences, and I'm willing to now give that AI tool, ChatGPT, and of course people don't really bother too much, they just give the data and consume, but I'm willing to give the data and have that result, but still afterwards the data is still mine that are used, related to me. I know this makes things much more complex, but in a world of also blockchain and the reality that you could actually build a system that data is decentralized rather with the consumer than with the different companies, this could make it very interesting.
Yeah, and I think where we're going to particularly see a lot of test cases, consumers really kind of fighting this, is where the Europeans, what the Europeans call, sensitive personal data, your sexual preference. You don't want that to be used against you, obviously, in any decision. Your political affiliation, again, you don't want that to be used against you. The Europeans have a whole criteria. Are you a member of a trade union? Things of that nature. All good stuff. And if you're, I think that's where we're going to see, if any, test cases on sensitive personal data. And I think that's probably where the consumer is most likely to, the European consumer is most likely to succeed and probably get the most sympathy.
But there's one example where I would challenge also the European approach is, what is really most protected in Switzerland, for example, is of course health data, right?
Biometrics.
Exactly, biometrics, but also of course my whole history of health, and by right, of course, I don't want that everyone knows. And again, sexual preferences and many other reasons. I don't want people to just know my whole health history. On the other hand, if I'm a runner, I go into mountains, run around, and suddenly I fall down and get seriously injured, and I'm not even conscious, I would actually be even open, and that might be now challenged by the audience, but to have a chip that could save my life. I mean, back then, for example, in military service, you always had your identification. That worst case, if you're on the battlefield, at least they knew, okay, this is you and this is your blood type, right? Because that's most important when you're losing blood. What is your blood type? And I would be even happy to have a chip that at least has my blood type, if that's so. Of course, meanwhile, you can find that blood type much faster, but it can be so critical to really you survive. Right? Hard to compare this now to the AI topic, but still, in some cases where you're maybe not even conscious, it could well be very important that even in a health application of giving you now the right medicine, of where we maybe also need to use some of your data and run it on a tool that is leveraging, again, Gen AI, large language models, and there you might not even be in a state to press the button again in terms of GDPR compliance. It's so complex, once again, to make the right thing for the consumer, especially if he cannot even maybe decipher for himself.
Yeah, and I think the answer to that is using AI as a tool to help the humans. So keep the human in the loop, as opposed to AI replacing the human. And I think that's the key. And even in a lot of the financial institutions that I'm helping, they're normally using AI systems as to generate operational efficiencies, but not necessarily to replace the entire humans in the system. So whether it's a AI system to help coaching and training employees, all the way through to helping do surveillance on suspicious transactions or suspicious correspondence, there's typically a human still in the loop. So in suspicious transaction monitoring, the AI system will tell the compliance team, oh, hey, rather than a human having to go through mounds and mounds of emails. Hey, the AI system have identified this particular email or this particular transaction as looking kind of suspicious. You might want to have a look at that. So it's still a human making the decision.
Absolutely, but I wait for the moment where you actually were trained through a Gen AI model and you make a mistake because actually the training was slightly false. How do you go back to now claim against the tool that you use to train or the human who actually did it?
Yeah, absolutely. And look, I mean, hallucination risk, which I think is what you're referring to, is exactly something that a lot of regulators are alive to, which is the risk of AI generating what sounds like plausible outputs, plausible results and conclusions, but are just patently wrong. And we all know, in the legal space, lawyers particularly are very conscious of those lawyers that turn up to court and go, Your Honor, I plead my case. Oh, my case was written by AI. And the judge turning around and saying, thanks, that sounds great, but your case is completely false. All the legal precedents that you've cited don't even exist. And that's exactly hallucination risk. And I think a lot of regulators are alive to, even the Hong Kong SFC is saying, hey, look, you need steps in place to make sure that you've dealt with hallucination risk, that your AI system is being trained on good data, so it's not going to come up with garbage, the old garbage in, garbage out. It's not
brings me
garbage.
back to the sandbox environment or also the fail fast and learn. So if you overregulate, then maybe you never fail and also learn. So mistakes will happen, and that's also being human and also systems not being perfect. So we don't know today on what cases will come up, but there will be very interesting cases where things that were either regulated or not regulated and were not picked up. So to also sum it up a bit as we are almost on time, is there anything you believe in the next 2-3 years that we can expect also in terms of regulations? Now, again, we have the EU gold standard, but something you also believe is in the works or things we should watch out for?
I think we're waiting. Normally in two things usually kind of bring about change in the industry. Number one, a big incident. Like I said, Facebook in the data privacy field, it was Facebook and the Russians using Facebook for election interference, and how GDPR was used to go after to Facebook. We're gonna we might see in a couple of years' time that similar kind of event, but this time the European Artificial Intelligence Act being used against some AI system provider. And it's going to be interesting to see what's going to come out of that. I think that's point number one. I think point number two is from these incidents, we might see some regulators sit down and say, particularly regulators already have a forum for them to speak to their global colleagues, to sit down and say, okay, what are the kind of common standards that we're expecting to adopt? And I think the third thing we might see is for international organizations that use AI, like I said, they might end up saying, hey, look, even though you are not, you're an AI developer, you're not in the European Union, but we've got a big operation in Europe. Europe's always going to be a big market. We can't, we're always going to either use European personal data, or it might be the AI system might be available to Europe. Even though Europe might not be our headquarters, we're a global bank or a global financial institution, we still need you to follow the European standard, just because Europe is big. Interestingly enough, China's looking at what Europe's doing and coming up with something that's drawing or following some of what the Europeans have done. So the Chinese rules are going to be are already extraterritorial as well. Similar to
it's very interesting that this is coming from China, where there's always a bit of a Western view that actually there it's less in the interest of customers or people, but as you confirm here, I mean, it's very much in the interest of people then.
Yeah, and definitely it's got a lot more interesting China-specific characteristics. Definitely, it's making sure that not just on consumer protection, but also, a lot of rules focusing on making sure that it's compliant with Communist Party expectations. So, that's something that, again, AI developers outside of China may not be so focused on. They might not think, okay, I need to be careful about my outputs on a political context as well.
Very interesting. Apologies, we're almost on time, but a very interesting conversation. To maybe round it off, Errol, so where can the viewers find you and your company? Yeah,
look, I'm on LinkedIn. I maybe at the end of the podcast we can have a little link to my LinkedIn. But I think that the final words I'd like to leave people thinking about is, like I said, I mean, AI is moving from a disruptive technology to a more mature product where, like I said, the Europeans are saying, hey, it needs a CE mark. We're treating it like any other product coming into the European markets. That means that, for an AI developer, they're, chasing a pool of clients and a pool of investment money in an increasingly competitive environment. It's important to think about, okay, what do my clients need, and what can I provide them to make their lives easier to sell my AI system more successfully? And it helps to understand what those regulations are, so that you can say to your client, yes, I know you've got a headache in terms of working out what regulatory requirements and regulatory hoops you need to jump through, but we've done some of that work for you. Here it is. Here's our privacy data impact assessment. Here's our cybersecurity assessment. Here you go. That can sometimes, I think, give a leg up to an AI developer that's in an increasingly competitive environment.
Thank you so much, Errol. Once again, it's very interesting, and I'm for sure we'll now consider this as well for ourselves at Synpulse 8, as we have our Pulse 8 platform. So you find us, of course, on social media, LinkedIn and YouTube, and looking forward to then release the podcast episode, and maybe we do a follow-up into more detail.
I'd love to.
Thank you, Errol.
Thank you so much.